Epic Games have been a major player in the games industry for some time now, thanks to the Unreal Engine. Engine development is expensive and time-consuming, so lots of developers value being able to license a pre-built engine so they can focus on the game, rather than the underlying technology, and this is only becoming more true. As graphics continue to improve and the size and budget of games continues to increase, even developers who traditionally worked with proprietary engines, such as CD Projekt Red on the Witcher series or Microsoft's Halo series, are looking to switch to Unreal in future. Unreal has always offered a graphically competitive but relatively easy to use engine, so its popularity with both large and small developers throughout the years has always made sense. But the series of games the engine is named for, the Unreal series, has always taken something of a background role within cultural consciousness. Despite driving much of the development behind one of the most popular engines in the industry, and being well respected and highly praised by those who played them, they've always ended up playing second fiddle to other games, released around the same time. So today we're going to have a look at them, both the single-player focused Unreal games and their multiplayer focused cousins with the Unreal Tournament games, and we'll also briefly touch on the Xbox exclusive Unreal Championship games. Released in 1998, Unreal was developed as a joint venture by then Epic Mega Games and Digital Extremes, who these days are best known for the free-to-play shooter Warframe. The technology behind the engine allowed for graphical features that exceeded that of other games released around the same time, and even for some time after. Coloured lighting, volumetric fog, advanced animated skyboxes, and transparent or reflective textures would all be used to great effect throughout, and these advances would be immediately apparent from the very start of the game. The opening sequence, escaping from the crashed prison ship Vortex Rikers, is an incredibly atmospheric start. There aren't any enemies in the opening level, rather it's a suspenseful tour of the broken vessel, all flickering lights and ruptured steam vents as the screams of your fellow prisoners and guards echo through the halls. Doors jam and gunfire flares behind them. As they finally open, there's nothing there but the corpses of guards and a strange creature disappearing out of view. It's a short but very effective opener, and exiting the Vortex Rikers is one of the most memorable moments of this era of gaming. Leaving the dark and claustrophobic halls of the ship to emerge into the wide open plain of Nine Leaves Falls is a wonderful reveal even to this day. Tall canyon walls fall far beneath you to reveal luminous waters, the upper level of the area is cut through by the path of your crashed vessel. It's an environment few games were able to match before this. Unreal cycles through various design elements throughout its journey across Na Pali, but the saturated and varied coloured palette, along with the high contrast and pre-rendered skyboxes, always give the outdoor areas an amazing vibe specific to this era. It's often like playing through a world made in one of those early 3D renderers like Bryce 3D. Unreal's editor still uses a brush-based system like id Software's Quake engines before it, but the editor and underlying technology allowed for it to more easily create the complex polygons needed for the more organic shapes necessary for these more open exteriors. And this focus on exterior areas sets it apart from the corridors and industrial complexes of Quake 2, released the previous year. Nine Leaves Falls also offers the game's first taste of its partially non-linear level design. While the game is overall a linear experience and most levels have a clear critical path, throughout are levels like this, with either multiple paths or optional areas. You can beeline straight for the mines as soon as you exit the Vortex Rikers, but you're more likely to wander to the gnarly hut nearby, and falling into the river far beneath will reveal a canyon and cave system for you to explore. Unfortunately, you do eventually need to proceed to the mines. The interior levels of Unreal are always its weakest. Part of this is an aesthetic problem. While the outside areas capture a unique aesthetic unused before and rarely used since, the interiors tend towards a much more generic design language. The mines and starship interiors, while unique from one another and portraying the differences in ownership well, aren't anything drastically different from the same sort of sci-fi interiors of other games, and wouldn't look out of place in one of the Quake games. The temples and castles of the Na'Li are better in this regard, but still suffer from the second problem of gameplay. Many of the enemies in Unreal are far more agile than enemies in other games of the era, and they use a variety of projectile weapons, often mirrors of weapons the player has access to. But the more cramped corridors of the interior levels dampen the effects of these choices. The player has a harder time dodging damage, and the enemies aren't able to bring the full range of actions to bear against you. Outside and in more open areas, enemies can dodge, use shields, and rush you down for melee attacks, but as the space becomes limited so do to these abilities, making encounters far less dynamic. That's not to say that these levels are bad, of course. There are still memorable encounters and set pieces, as well as some engaging areas to explore. The first encounter with the Scar Warrior, your primary enemy throughout the game, is a particularly memorable one. Having detoured from your objective to deactivate a force field, you make your way back only to find your path blocked. Trapped in a narrow corridor, the lights shut off one by one with a rhythmic thunk, eventually plunging you into darkness. Then the growling starts. Doors open from either end of the corridor, and from one rushes a Scar Warrior. You're forced to fight it in the dark, illuminated only by gunfire and flares. It's a tough fight this early, made harder by the cramped conditions. Their agility and strength make the Scar a satisfying enemy throughout much of the game. The whole roster of enemies make for some quality encounters, but the Scar are always just unpredictable enough to keep you on your toes throughout your journey. Your mission to escape the planet of Na Pali really is a journey too. There are only 2 points in the game where a teleporter transports you from one level to the next, and the first of these places you in clear view of where you came from. The rest of the movement is done on foot, with each area transitioning to the next in a way that feels natural. It does a great job of making the game feel like a cohesive adventure, rather than a simple series of levels, further enhanced by the time of day progressing throughout the game. You start around midday, but as you progress the sun sets, and the last few missions take place in the dead of night. It gives a sense of continuity that would be lacking in many other shooters, and all of this comes together to make the planet of Na Pali feel like a coherent place, even if the plot that drives your adventure falters at times. Throughout the game, all of your objectives and background information is provided through your universal translator. Whenever you're near a piece of writing in the world, whether that's a sign, book, or computer readout, your translator will chirp and pressing a button will bring up the text. This is a good system for grounding gameplay instructions in the world, but it can sometimes be confusing. The degree of its use varies from map to map. Some barely use it at all, but most will use it as a way to indicate your current objectives, both in the current map and where you're trying to get to afterwards. There isn't always the best feedback, however, for when you've achieved your per-map objectives. This is again at its worst in the indoor areas. Take the ISV Cran, for example. Mid-game you reach a crashed human ship. You approach it through the huge trench it dug into the earth as it crashed. Inside you find the crew dead and the halls crawling with Scar. It's a pretty good level overall. There's some good environmental storytelling in the different areas where the crew made their various last stands, and you can put together a decent timeline of the crew's attempts to hold back the invaders. And while you know your objective is to activate the transporter to get you to your next destination, the steps to achieve that can be somewhat obscured. A tense fight through monster-infested halls becomes a trudge of circling a deck several times, trying to hit every button to deactivate the next force field. It's never as bad as the key hunting in games that came before it. Usually a few laps of the entire map is enough to get things moving again, even if you don't know what exactly you did to achieve that. But it does drag down some of the otherwise good levels throughout. The Cran is actually a really good section otherwise. It's the first time the game really ramps up the number of enemies you face, and barely scraping by on your last dregs of health with your ammo spent really sells the threat the crew were facing before they died. One of the best uses of the translator for background storytelling comes later in the Bluff Ever Smoking. The Bluff is a hilltop monastery in the centre of a lake. Scar have taken it over from the Nali and are using it now as a prison. As you work your way throughout its complex layout, you gradually uncover the story of Kira, a woman captured from the ISV Cran. She's actually mentioned in a log by a group looking for her several missions prior, but here you find where she was being held. You can put together her story, how she fought her captors, how the Nali prisoners hiding in the sewers helped her escape, and finally how she took refuge in the bell tower. Unfortunately, this is where her story ends, with a corpse. It's a simple story, but tracing her path through the monastery is a more effective way of guiding the player to their objectives than the more static use of computer readouts telling you to activate such and such in other areas. Naturally, other attempts at more in-depth storytelling don't pan out as well. The Nali Water Temple earlier in the game, for example. As you make your way through this strange ancient temple, the walls are scattered with writings which seem to depict oddly recent events. The arrival of the Scar, as well as the separate arrival of a different ship nearby, from which they got their ancient artifact at the centre of the temple, a 6-barreled rocket and grenade launcher. It doesn't make a lot of sense why an ancient temple would depict such seemingly recent events, or, if it's not ancient, how the Nali would have built this temple after the Scar arrived and began subjugating them. It's lore that fills in the backstory of the setting, but it's not developed in a way that makes a great deal of sense within the setting. The Gnarly themselves are difficult to pin down as an inclusion. Aesthetically, they draw from a wide range of sources. Their ancient water temple gives a vague sense of Mesoamerican ruins. They themselves are tall, four-armed creatures with elements that merge Native American and pseudo-Hindu mystics visuals, but their architecture draws from a more generic medieval European design styles. In fact, their primary religious icon is a crucifix adapted to be used on someone with four arms. Crucifixes that you do see the Gnarly tied to as punishment throughout the game. This clear nod to Christian iconography is theologically absurd, but acts less as a specific piece of world building and more as a visual shorthand to get a general vibe across. They fall heavily into the noble savage trope, peaceful to the point of absolute non-violence, friendly and helpful but incapable of mounting any resistance against the Scar invaders, and throughout make references to a messiah that will be sent to save them. It seems like your character is going to fall into the white saviour role, but you really don't. You can save them at times, and if you do, they'll often open secret passages to resource caches for you, but there's absolutely no punishment for letting them die or even actively killing them. In fact, at one point, pushing the statues off the top of one of their churches will reward you with powerful health and armour items. Your fight across their world damages the invaders, but doesn't actually do anything to free them as a people, and often feels more like they exist only as collateral damage in your personal fight to get off-world. They don't really matter. They're a background element to the game's setting, which is kind of problematic when they're a colonised people designed to use many of the stereotypical tropes associated with real-world colonised peoples. It's a shame because it creates the space for some interesting storytelling, but ultimately ignores their inclusion in favour of the player's personal goals. You travel through their villages, towns and religious sites, but never get a sense of who they are as a people. It's their world, but you're the only one living in it. The Scar, on the other hand, provide a lot more clarity to their role. The colonial occupation of Na Pali by the Scar is well established throughout. You can actually track the infrastructure of their occupation as you travel across the planet, from the mines at the start, to the prison of the Bluff Ever Smoking, to the storage facility in the Dassa Mountain Pass. This storage facility even contains crates looted from the crashed ISV Cran. The best example of this comes midway through the game. You eventually reach the largest Gnarly settlement yet, Gnarly Haven. It seems relatively peaceful. There are only a few Scar here. The area is mostly guarded by a smaller race who it appears are themselves subservient to the Scar. The Gnarly aren't particularly happy. A local tavern keeper laments the abuse of its occupiers, but there's no four-armed crucifixes, no ruined houses of murdered Gnarly. Despite the occupation of their world, this place seems more or less untouched, until you dig deeper. Hidden in the attic of one of the buildings is an observation post, which opens the way to an even larger outpost, hidden within the mountain the town is built around. Not only are the Scar carefully monitoring the Gnarly town, it's revealed that the peace here is deliberate. Logs show how the Scar are deliberately leaving the town relatively untouched to create the illusion of freedom, an illusion which stops the Gnarly from rebelling outright, but nonetheless the Gnarly even here are controlled by the Scar. It's a pretty powerful moment. Before, the Scar just seemed like alien raiders, but this reveals an intelligence behind the occupation of Na Pali, a strategy. It says something about colonial occupation, about control. It's unfortunate that the rest of the game isn't quite as tuned into the themes that evolve from the world building present throughout the game. One of my favourite levels in the game is actually a strange one. Late in the game there's a level called Serpent's Canyon. It's short and quite uneventful. All it contains is a slow, winding boat ride through the canyon, then a small windmill before moving on. There's only 2 enemies in the entire level, but this is what I like about it. Unreal has an amazing atmosphere throughout, but the high-speed combat can often take priority, distracting you. Serpent's Canyon forces you to take a moment to breathe, relax, enjoy the ride and listen to the music, while you take in the world's ambiance. It acts as a quiet interlude before plunging you into the Gnarly castle and the Scar mothership that the game ends with. The back part of the game is the weakest, unfortunately. As the game goes on, the proportion of more obtuse levels increases, and the game gradually introduces variants of existing enemies with even more health than the already generous health pools of standard enemies. The weakest component, however, is the encounter design. While individual enemies are engaging to fight, the game never escalates to a point of fighting large numbers of enemies, sticking to fighting just a few at a time. This is fine early on, but later, in order to up the ante, it starts spawning more and more enemies in a row. This works well enough when they're in an area you're travelling through, ensuring that there are always one or two enemies when you pass through it. The problem is, in these later levels, it will often lock you into an arena until you've defeated all of them, but still only ever spawning one or two at a time. This doesn't create an interesting challenge, just stretches out a fight to take a great deal of time before opening the way to the next area. The mothership also lacks some of the iconic and unique environmental design of the outside areas, making the final stretch rather bland in comparison to the rest of the game. Which is a shame. You eventually deactivate the ship's power generator, kill the Scar Queen, and hijack an escape pod that leaves you floating in orbit, waiting to be picked up. Unreal was well received when it came out, as well it should be. It's a unique journey through an alien landscape, even if there is some inconsistency in the design language used throughout. But it wouldn't be as well remembered as it perhaps deserves. 6 months later, Half-Life would be released. Despite Unreal's superiority in terms of technical graphics, it was ultimately a well-designed and prettier version of a style of game that had been made many times before. Half-Life, on the other hand, was something new. It focused on narrative with fully voiced and animated characters talking to you in real time, combined with its naturalistic level design, brimming with environmental storytelling, as well as its complex enemies that, through clever use of voice lines, would feel like the real thinking opponent. All of these things made Half-Life the standout hit of 1998. Unreal wouldn't be the only game forgotten in the wake of Half-Life's release, but it is certainly one of the more deserving of being remembered. After the release of Unreal, Epic would drop the word mega from their title and relocate its headquarters to North Carolina. It had previously been a distributed organisation with developers spread around the world, but this move allowed the studio to move its team to the same location for future works. They would continue to work with Digital Extremes on the Unreal Tournament games in future, but development of Unreal's mission pack, Return to Na Pali, would be handed over to Legend Entertainment. The expansion was intended to be developed quickly and would be released about a year after the base game. To achieve this, it was mostly made up of levels cut from the main game. I've seen this used as a point of derision against it, and in fact I've barely heard anyone talking about the expansion at all, and when they do, I've not heard people have good things to say about it. I find this strange, as I had a good time with it. It's short, just under half the length of the main game, and true, the best levels in it aren't as good as the base game. But, at the same time, the worst levels are better than the worst of the base game. There's a stronger focus on narrative this time around. While Unreal dropped you straight into a cell on the Vortex Rikers, this time around it opens with a cutscene setting the scene. Prisoner 849 has been picked up from her escape pod by a Terran military vessel, the Bodega Bay. They're looking for research data held on a crashed ship, the Prometheus, and as the resident expert, they send you instead, in exchange for a pardon and a ride back to Earth. There's interludes between missions for 849 to record log entries. They're a mixed bag overall. On one hand, they do a better job of making your overarching objective clear, but their delivery is a little weak. The slightly disinterested tone and tendency to reiterate self-evident plot points did put me in mind of Harrison Ford's famously bad narration from the theatrical cut of Blade Runner, which is never something you want to be reminding people of. But it does lend 849 a lot more character than previously. They also get worse as the game goes on. The first half tends to be fine, if a bit much having a log after every level, but after you find the Prometheus and are inevitably betrayed by the military, you set off in search of a shuttle to escape the planet, and almost every log from then on can be summarised as, "I'm still heading for the shuttle." One particular touch in the logs I was glad about was a reference to the Na'Li early on. Overall, they aren't treated much better than before, still kind of a background element, but in one interlude, 849 expresses happiness at having refilled one of their wells with water, and mentions she's glad to see them again. It doesn't do anything to give the Na'Li more agency in the narrative, but the main character expressing fondness for them did a lot to help give a sense of how you're meant to be reading them. Previously, you could help, ignore, or even slaughter them freely, and the game would never judge you one way or another. And with your character never commenting on it, you couldn't be certain how much you're supposed to care about them. By expressing it more directly, it creates a better connection with them. It's still a bit of a white saviour trope, but it makes them feel more like something you're supposed to be actively connecting with. I suspect the overall attempt to focus more on narrative is something of a direct response to Half-Life, especially given a moment towards the end. In the final cutscene, once you've grabbed your shuttle, your character remarks that it seems unlikely you could take on a Freeman-class cruiser, but they need to try anyway. This may be nothing, it may be a coincidence, but to me it certainly seems like a slightly self-deprecating nod to the absolute dominance of Half-Life at the time. The logs do make the expansion feel less like a cohesive journey, however. The game still doesn't make any massive jumps in location between levels, but the interludes break it up just enough, and the slightly more disjointed level set all make transitions between maps feel a tad more abrupt, disrupting the sense of continuity. Levels are also mostly more linear, which does help to reduce the time spent wandering around the more obtuse levels, but does make some aspects of exploration a little less interesting. I say most because there's actually a few very open levels, even more so than anything in the base game, though these are few and far between. There's also a few new weapons. This is another area I've seen people criticise. Unreal had a nicely rounded arsenal of unusual projectile weapons, so the more generic assault rifle, rocket launcher and grenade launcher seem very dull in comparison, and I've seen it argued that the assault rifle is particularly out of place. I disagree mostly. The rocket and grenade launchers are certainly slightly unnecessary given that the 6-barreled hybrid option is still available, but the assault rifle is a nice force multiplier for the slightly amped up combat encounters, while still being balanced by eating through ammo faster than anything in the base game, so use does have to be somewhat limited, especially after the first few levels. I don't think their inclusion overall disrupts the existing arsenal too much, and their narrative inclusion is well justified. The military may be sending you on a suicide mission, but they'd prefer you die after you complete it, so it makes sense that you be given some extra hardware. There's also the fact that all 3 weapons and their ammo are only available from ammo drops scattered by the military in advance of your mission. This makes them feel like a limited resource, given you can't reliably restock them from enemies, and means you can't restock them at all if the level is indoors, since the drops don't land there. It also helps to paint the military as uncaring, given that some of the drops landed in a gnarly village, damaging some of their buildings, showing the military to be as callous as the Scar when it comes to the natives. There is one major flaw with these new weapons, however, and that's when they're turned against you. Halfway through the game when the military betrays you, they send a squad of marines after you, and they're equipped with the same weapons. Almost every other enemy in the game uses either projectiles or melee attacks, so suddenly being thrown up against several enemies with high damage, fast-firing hit-scan weapons creates a rhythm of combat completely unlike anything else in the game, and you're wholly unprepared for it. They don't ever appear again after the fight, fortunately, but it makes it the single toughest and most frustrating fight in the entire base game and expansion combined. It's a real low point in an otherwise solid experience. Beyond that though, the worst thing you can say about the expansion is that it's simply more Unreal. Slightly less polished, slightly less ambitious, but overall if the base game left you wanting more, it's a good enough reason to take another romp across the surface of Na Pali. It is unfortunately the last chance to do so, but the rest of the series would open up a whole galaxy of new worlds to fight across, just mostly against other people. Of all the games in the Unreal series, Unreal Tournament casts the longest cultural shadow. So much so that when Netflix announced Secret Level, the video game-based spin-off of animation anthology series Love, Death and Robots, they did so with a lavishly recreated rendition of Unreal Tournament's memorable opening cutscene. Tournament's initial release was originally overshadowed by the release of the hotly anticipated Quake 3 Arena just weeks before, which sold better at the time and was far more widely represented in the esports scene. Despite this, Unreal Tournament did build a sizable following in the years since, and is rightly remembered as a classic of arena shooters to this day. Unreal Tournament was actually one of the earliest games I remember playing. Little Sam would play, hands shaking with adrenaline, desperately trying to make it to 15 kills in a one-on-one match against a bot on the lowest difficulty. I've been playing Unreal Tournament or its sequels throughout much of my life, but the truth is, I've never even touched the multiplayer aspect of it. I'm not a big fan of multiplayer games, especially competitive ones. It's not that I'm not a competitive person, I still feel all the emotions related to the feeling of competitiveness, but I simply do not enjoy those feelings and prefer to avoid them when possible. As such, I've always stuck to bot matches. Fortunately, Unreal Tournament not only featured solid bot support, but also had a good variety of content to keep it an engaging way to play. I will concede that Quake 3 did play slightly better than Unreal Tournament. In addition to the more extensive development history of making competitive multiplayer shooters, Arena's arsenal was designed from the ground up to be used against human opponents. Tournament's weapons, on the other hand, are mostly adapted from Unreal. They've all been visually updated, some have been changed slightly, and there have been a few new additions, but it's a familiar enough set of weapons to the single-player outing. The agility of Unreal's enemies does mean that this arsenal adapts well to the more chaotic movement of human players or bots designed to act like them, but overall the movement and weapons of Unreal Tournament aren't quite as tight as Quake 3's. In terms of content, however, Unreal Tournament is head and shoulders above Quake 3. When Arena first launched, it only featured Deathmatch, Team Deathmatch and Capture the Flag. A few more team-based modes would be added later with the Team Arena expansion, but Unreal Tournament launched right out of the gate with all three of these modes, as well as the Control Point mode Domination and Assault, an asymmetric mode where one team would be tasked with completing a series of objectives while the other team defended, after which the teams would switch sides, and the team with the fastest time would be the winner. This gave Tournament more variety, which ultimately gave it more longevity outside the more competitive esports scenes. The thing that has always put Tournament above Arena for me, though, was the maps themselves. While both series have a history of mixing medieval and sci-fi aesthetics, Quake 3 opted for a decidedly abstract take on map design. Unreal Tournament's levels, however, are often designed to at least appear to be actual places. The layouts of course won't make any sense, they're still designed as spaces for combat, but aesthetically they're designed to look like a variety of space stations, castles, outposts, and even city streets. There's a good mix of map aesthetics too, from Egyptian tombs to rusty oil rigs. There are also a mix of more abstract spaces too, but even then they have a little more panache, such as the iconic Capture the Flag map Facing Worlds, a pair of tall, symmetrical temples floating in space. This eclectic mix of environments mirrors Unreal in some ways with its mix of medieval castles, ancient ruins, and sci-fi bases, but expands it out to an even wider variety. However, Unreal's smorgasbord of visual reference points taking place on a single planet could at times create a sense of the game's design language being unfocused. Unreal Tournament expanding upon that creates a broader sense of a setting at large. Furthermore, there's something of a narrative layer to it as well, with each level in the single-player ladder receiving a small description describing its location and inclusion in the tournament. This places many of the locations in the game firmly within the setting, while also justifying both the more abstract levels as well as the more gameplay-focused layout of these individual spaces, since each has been adapted for use in the tournament. Opponents also receive short descriptions, often dropping tidbits of information as to the wider setting. The variety of locations available keeps the game fresh and engaging, but matching levels of graphical fidelity, approaches to colour, and the engine's unique approach to music tracks still result in a specific vibe that keeps all of the levels feeling like they belong to the same game, even if their specific environments were widely differentiated from one another. Of course, having these kinds of maps make up the majority of the base game means that they acted as something of a guide as to what made a good arena, so when modders got their hands on it, they continued to make similar maps. One of the big things Unreal did, and this remained a standard throughout all of the PC releases of the series, was bundling the editing tools with the game. Modding existed in games before, but often required external tools, but with the Unreal series, anyone who owned the game and had the patience to read the documentation could start making maps. Even more importantly, the file type that the engine stored maps in didn't require compilation. This meant that maps bundled with the game could be opened in the editor directly, providing examples for modders to look at and learn from. This led to a huge modding scene for Unreal Tournament, and as a result a huge number of additional maps are available to play on. The variety of textures allowed by a mixture of maps that are shipped in the base game allowed modders to use a broad range of aesthetics to act as a baseline for their own levels, but at the same time, the low fidelity of late 90s graphics still made it possible for individual modders to create their own expanded texture sets to push their work even further. I find exploring digital spaces to be very engaging, so this is always something that has appealed to me. Having access to more maps than I could ever possibly explore across a huge range of themes is one of the reasons I still jump back into Unreal Tournament to this day. While Epic's focus would remain on the Unreal Engine and the multiplayer side of the series after Unreal, it wouldn't be the last single-player campaign in the setting. Impressed by both their work on Return to Na Pali, as well as their other work using the Unreal Engine on the shooter based on the Wheel of Time novels, Legend Entertainment would be given the reins to Unreal's sequel, Unreal 2: The Awakening. One of the big new additions to Unreal Engine 2 was a dedicated terrain system, allowing for more natural and smooth terrain over larger areas, and Unreal 2's mission-based structure would see this system used across a wide variety of environments. The overall aesthetic maintains the series' vibrant use of colour, though this time its palettes tended towards being more unified on a mission-by-mission basis. Unfortunately, the variety of planets you visit during the game would not be matched in terms of the architectural diversity. I've got nothing against the mix of concrete brutalist and steel industrial aesthetics used throughout the game. In fact, I'm quite fond of them in areas, but it does represent a far more generic design choice for sci-fi than those featured throughout the first game. And unfortunately, that's Unreal 2's greatest sin. It feels far more generic than its predecessor. One of the big things that contributes to this generic feeling is actually a structural one. The Scar are back as an enemy, and there are a few other alien races to fight against, but these are all featured either in the first few or final few missions. In fact, about half of the game's missions feature some form of alien as the primary enemy, with the other half featuring one of two groups of very similar human mercenaries. This wouldn't be a bad split, but instead of weaving these missions between one another, the entire middle half of the game is fought against human opponents, making it feel like a lot more of the game is spent fighting these mercenaries than there actually is. Despite this, there's a good mix of objectives throughout the game, shifting between a mix of assaults, rescue missions, and defensive holdouts throughout a variety of facilities. And although the architecture tends towards a similar set of quite generic design choices, the variety of planetary environments these missions take place on keep things fresh without feeling too repetitive, despite the long run of human opponents during the middle of the game. Overall, your movement speed is significantly slowed down compared to the first game. This wasn't uncommon for the era. The early 2000s was something of a transitional period for shooters, moving away from the fast-paced, arcadey shooters of the 90s to something slower and more supposedly realistic. Your arsenal has faced changes in this direction as well. Instead of the variety of strange alien weaponry of the first game, there's a more standard mix of assault rifles, shotguns, and rocket launchers. In fact, it's the only game in the series to use a completely unique set of weapons. Every other game uses a similar set of weapons, but here there's no flak cannon, no bio rifle, and sadly no shock rifle. What is here is decently satisfying to use, but despite the wide range of weaponry available, ammo pools tend to be limited, so you tend to be stuck using the same weapons any given enemy happens to be using. The greater focus on hit-scan weapons from both you and your enemies, as well as the combination of faster projectiles and slower movement, means that avoiding damage through movement is no longer as much of an option, and you have to rely more on cover and your larger health and armor pools. This makes you feel like something of a tank throughout the game, which is narratively fitting. You aren't an escaped prisoner stumbling out on a crashed ship into an unknown world anymore, you're the space cops. To be more specific, you are John Dalton, a marshal in the Terran Colonial Authority. You patrol a quiet region of space, responding to distress signals and calling in better equipped marines when there's something you can't handle. Naturally, as the protagonist of a first-person shooter, there's nothing you can't handle, and you'll often end up helping marines with the tasks they couldn't complete. Arguably justified by the fact that Dalton used to be a marine until he disobeyed an order to abandon civilians. On your first mission, you respond to a distress signal from a mining outpost. Scar attacked them shortly after uncovering a strange artifact in the mines, and after retrieving it, your sector commander sends you off to recover the rest of them. Despite a lot of the game feeling somewhat generic, there are the occasional bright spots of creative ideas, such as Acheron, a planet almost entirely coated by a huge biological organism, where terraforming efforts are literally killing the planet. A grotesque wasteland with hair instead of foliage. The corporation responsible for this facility has found one of the artifacts in the fleshy tunnels beneath the surface, and blowing it out of its housing wakes the planet, and you have to escape while fighting off the planet's own immune system. Or the Drac homeworld and its vast biomechanical warrens, in which you find the twisted remains of previous explorers held in stasis tubes and stitched together into tortured chimeras. There are glimpses of some real creativity throughout, and even the less surprising planets have some charm to them, but it's definitely disappointing that they didn't push for an even more unusual ideas throughout. The mission-based structure does give less of a sense of adventure compared to the first game, especially since there's a short run of missions in the middle which don't directly contribute to the overarching plot. But, while certainly not a masterpiece, your environments and objectives change regularly enough to keep things engaging. Between missions, you get to spend some time aboard your ship, the Atlantis. I always like this kind of thing, partly because I love a good spaceship, but mostly because it gives a good sense of continuity, as well as acting as a home base to release tension between missions while preparing you with briefings for the next. You also get to interact with your small crew, both as part of these briefings and more casually. These characters are surprisingly well-rounded. The writing isn't spectacular, but there's an underlying sense of familiarity between the characters that make them all very likeable and feel real in a way I wasn't expecting. Part of this is down to Naban, your pilot. Naban is a strange slime alien encased in an environmental suit. He struggles with speaking the language, mixing up words and tenses constantly in a way I thought would be annoying, but his friendly demeanour and insatiable curiosity make him very personable instead. He's the newest member of the crew and comes from a sheltered background. He's a prince back home and they want him kept out of harm's way, and until the events of the game, yours was the quietest patrol. Being a new member of the crew allows him to ask lots of questions, and it's through conversations with him that you get to know the backstory of the other crew members. This is a clever and effective way of providing exposition without feeling like a lore dump, since it comes through the lens of a new crew member trying to understand his shipmates better. He also asks questions about the various corporations, factions, and alien races you encounter throughout the game, and your character answering fills the player in on the wider setting. This feels more like exposition, but it's valuable information and feels natural enough. Isaac acts as your ship's engineer and weapon master. Despite his incredibly gruff exterior, he offers a friendly presence while explaining the various uses and alt-fire modes of the weapons you encounter along your way, as well as scrounging up new weapons for you to use as the game progresses. Despite clearly being a talented engineer, managing to keep the ship running with limited resources, he struggles with confidence. When working on a marine capital ship, he suffered a nervous breakdown during combat and accidentally opened the fighter bay's doors too early, blowing several crew members out into space. After this, he washed out and joined the TCA. He smokes constantly and suffered from alcoholism after the incident, but he's trying hard to be better, and it's revealed later that he's been completely sober since joining your crew. Despite this, it's clear he's never forgiven himself for his mistake, and neither has your last crew member, Ida. Despite looking like she should be selling AMD graphics cards, Ida is your first officer and manages all of your missions briefings. She's a no-nonsense sort who's hypercritical of Isaac. Some of her friends died when Isaac had his breakdown, but she has her own backstory for dropping out of the Marines, and there's an underlying sense that it's more herself she can't forgive rather than Isaac. During the Strider War, a war against a race that never made it into the final game, Ida helped develop the plan that ended the war. She tricked the Striders into attacking a planet by faking a major base there with electrical signals. Then, when their forces had landed, the Terran fleet hidden behind one of the planet moons moved in and nuked the site from orbit, wiping out the Striders' forces and ending the war. Unfortunately, it also cost the lives of around 200,000 civilians, which they couldn't evacuate in order to maintain the deception. Struggling with the decision, she quit the Marines and became untrusting of all forms of authority, who she blamed for putting her in that position. She continues to struggle with this decision throughout the game, becoming cold and closed off when it's brought up, and being constantly aggravated by Dalton's insistence on taking risks. She's also suspicious of your commanding officer Hawkins and your mission to retrieve the artifacts. Despite being a crew of dysfunctional, PTSD-ridden dropouts, these characters are all very likeable. They all feel like they have a rich backstories not just themselves, but between one another as well, and this familiarity and friendliness carries much of the narrative. I like these characters a lot, and it makes them more effective when they're killed shortly before the game's climax. Ida may have been wrong about Isaac being useless, but she was right about the fact that gathering glyph-marked artifacts that were split into 7 pieces and scattered across the galaxy is a recipe for disaster. You never find out who actually made the artifacts, but you do get to see what they do when they're all put together, and there are 2 hints throughout the game foreshadowing their use. The first comes early in a mission to the planet Hell. Hell is one of my favourite missions in the game. A military weapons research station on a frozen planet was researching another one of the artifacts before all contact was lost with it. After a tense walk through the corpse-filled hallways, you find the culprit. The base has been overrun by giant alien spiders. What follows is a fight deep into the research base, fighting hordes of spiders armed with a flamethrower. It's great. Deep within the facility you find the source of the monsters. The scientists have been working on several experiments and the smaller spiders were one of them. Unfortunately, they escaped and made their way to a different lab where the high energy beams were being aimed at the artifact. Interacting with this beam is causing the spiders to suddenly grow to a massive scale. In fact, you can release several other alien creatures to be grown by the beam as well. The second hint comes later, funnily enough in a different research station on a frozen planet. The facility has been attacked by 2 different mercenary groups, but they can't get into the room with the artifacts because of an alien creature known as a Kai. You can't get in there either until you find the head researcher to convince it to let you in. The Kai, it seems, are particularly drawn to the artifacts, and apparently it hasn't left them alone since they came to the facility. The Kai are a strange inclusion in the game. They can't talk, and in fact you only encounter one other living Kai before this one, a hard-to-notice worker at the back of the first room of the game, though their corpses can be found throughout the various facilities. Talking with Naban reveals that there are peaceful, nomadic people travelling around performing menial labour throughout the galaxy. I like the design, a strange gangly mess of tentacle-like limbs, completely inhuman, but evoking a sense of harmlessness through its big eyes and hunched posture, along with their ragged capes and strange talismans that hang around their necks. They kind of fill the same role as the Na'Li from the first game, and if you told me they originally were going to be the Na'Li, I'd believe you. They get even less background, unfortunately, a genuine background element that seems to be innocuous inclusion until suddenly they're important to the plot. They probably should have featured more heavily throughout, since by the time they became important, it's entirely possible that the player will have missed most of the exposition regarding them. Having gathered all of the artifacts, you return to TCA headquarters to drop them off, only to discover the Scar have captured it. The Atlantis is shot down while trying to rescue you, killing your whole crew, so instead you're taken to the Dorian Grey, flagship of Commander Hawkins, your commanding officer. Aboard you find the purpose of the artifacts. Long ago, an unknown species created an unstoppable army of genetically engineered warriors. When they were no longer needed, these genetic modifications were locked away inside the DNA of the Kai, but restoring the artifacts causes nearby Kai to mutate back into their original form, hulking monsters with the ability to launch miniature black holes from their arms. You defeat one and steal its arm cannon, but the ship is overrun by the rest, and you need to plot a course into the sun before reaching an escape pod, destroying the ship, the Kai, and the artifacts. There's a unique problem when it comes to games with regards to point of view characters. In any story, the character's actions are predetermined, but with games, the interactive elements give the impressions that you are in control. You aren't in full control, of course. The character can still only take actions within the plot that the developers have prepared, but since the player is embodying a character during the events of the plot, it can create a disconnect between the character and the player if the character makes a decision within the plot that the player disagrees with. While this can be used to great effect, when unintended it can lead to a very unsatisfying experience. It's possible that a player might think destroying the artifact is a bad idea, that it would make more sense to study them further to properly control the Kai, instead of them running rampage after transforming. The key to Unreal 2 ensuring that the player and Dalton's decision align with one another was in the likeableness of your crew. It turns out it wasn't the Scar that shot down the Atlantis, it was the Dorian Grey. Hawkins has been lying to you the entire game. Despite telling you orders were coming from a General Drexler, Hawkins has been working alone to gather the artifacts. When Ida worked this out and refused to hand them over, he shot down the Atlantis himself to recover them. This betrayal leaves no room for doubt. Hawkins has to die, the artifacts need to be destroyed, and you need to get off the Dorian Grey to listen to the rest of your crew's final transmission. The trope of giving you an overpowered weapon in the final mission is a mixed bag here. The first car you fight is a very difficult encounter, but once you get your own black hole gun, it becomes a question of whoever shoots first wins, since both you and your enemies are effectively armed with one-shot kill weapons. Navigating the ship gets more difficult as the decaying orbit causes the gravity to go awry and the ship to list dramatically. It's a pretty tight final scramble to an escape pod, making it a climactic ending if things go your way, but if not, constant repetition of areas can take the wind out of it a little. Reaching the escape pod, you get to finish listening to the final transmission of your crew. Each member gets a moment to say their final goodbyes, and it makes for an effective ending. I liked this crew. Their relationships felt natural and their connections to Dalton felt real, so it's a bittersweet victory. While overall the game is far more generic than its predecessor, the variety in missions and character work always carried it for me, but I can understand why it never got the widespread acclaim of other games at the time. Despite its technical advances with regards to terrain and larger environments, next year Doom 3 would release, and id Tech 4's focus on smaller scale environments allowed for far higher levels of detail and fantastic lighting, leaving Unreal 2 behind in terms of graphical quality quite quickly. Worse, Half-Life 2 would release shortly after that, whose advances in physical interactions, graphical detail, and character expression would have a similar cooling effect to everything released around 2004 as the original did in 1998. It is unfortunate that Unreal 2 would be the final major jaunt through the setting. Despite feeling like less of a unified journey than the original or its expansion, it's still a journey worth taking. Eagle-eyed viewers may notice that I've skipped a game. While it did release before Unreal 2, I'm rolling coverage of Unreal Tournament 2003 in with Unreal Tournament 2004 for several reasons. For starters, 2003 is functionally impossible to get a copy of these days, since even before Epic started delisting the other games in the series, it never got a digital release. Secondly, the vast majority of content in 2003 was included in 2004. The minor gameplay balance differences can be restored with the 2003 mutator, and the old style of single player, a simple series of bot match ladders, was replaced with 2004's more complex tournament setup. Other than that, 2004 is a straight upgrade in terms of content, so I'll cover them together while making special note of the major new additions to 2004. From the first moment you start a match, 2004 feels spot on for an Unreal Tournament game. Truthfully, all of the tournament games feature a movement system that, while it has seen some minor alterations throughout the years, feels nonetheless consistent across titles. If you've played one, you can slip right into one of the others without issue. The weapon set is also familiar. There have been some changes. The sawblade firing Ripper has been retired, the sniper rifle is now a lightning gun, and the rocket launcher has been downgraded to 3 barrels from 6, but otherwise they're still the same group of satisfying weapons. Well balanced and fun to use in engagements with agile opponents. I have to admit though, I'm not hugely fond of the art style for this version. Similar to Unreal 2, they continue the use of vibrant colours with more refined palettes per level, but the exaggerated proportions and large details on the characters and weapons give the game a slightly not cartoony feel, but certainly an aesthetic you might associate with action figures. That said, the large silhouettes do make it easy to pick out enemies against the more detailed environments and quickly identify what they're armed with. Overall, the game feels like it's been tuned more with an eye for competition this time around. Levels still have a great variety and sense of place, with even more of them featuring some narrative background through descriptions, but they feel a lot more arena-focused than before. This greater focus on balanced competitive play also affects the game modes available. The full set of modes from the original are available, including Assault, as well as some new modes, the one change being the Domination game mode. In the first game, this was a King of the Hill style game mode where holding control points throughout the map would earn points, so you needed to hold the majority of points to actually win, or all of them for a quicker win. This has been replaced with Double Domination. Now each map only has 2 control points. You have to hold both for 10 seconds to win a point, first to a set number of points wins. I've always found this provides much less tactical depth than the more varied mode in the previous game. Worse, it means now most of the maps in the mode are symmetrical for balance. Previous domination maps could be sprawling and varied, and only Capture the Flag maps had symmetrical bases. Now, Capture the Flag, Double Domination, and new mode Bombing Run are all played on symmetrical maps, which I've always found leads to a far less interesting map design. Bombing Run sounds more interesting than it is. It's not a bad mode. It's set up like a ball game. You capture the ball in the middle, the person with the ball can pass it to others, shooting it into the enemy goal nets you points, walking it into the enemy goal nets you more. Unfortunately, against bots or with an uncoordinated team, this ends up playing a lot like a single flag variant of Capture the Flag, rather than an all-new mode, and as such I've never got super into it. A minor addition to the game is Invasion mode. Based on a mod for the original called Monster Hunt, Invasion acts as a horde mode played on deathmatch maps, where you work as a team to fight off waves of enemies, which, interestingly enough, are all based on enemies from the original Unreal. The big new addition for 2004, however, was Onslaught. The upgrade to Unreal Engine 2 meant that 2003 had the terrain system used so effectively in Unreal 2, as well as a physics engine necessary for vehicles, and I believe even included a rudimentary vehicle test map buried within the files. Developer Psyonix created a mod for 2003 called Vehicle Mod, and Epic would sign them on to add full vehicle support along with a new game mode, including them, to 2004. In Onslaught, you need to capture a series of connected nodes to reach the enemy base and then destroy it. Matches play out on some of the largest maps available to 2004 and allows for some large-scale fights, and combined with the vehicles, feels more like Unreal Tournament's take on Battlefield than the rest of the game. Nonetheless, it is a great mode that adds even more variety to the package. Vehicles control nicely, and there's a solid mix of maps and environments to be played on. Funnily enough, for a company whose earliest work was adding vehicles to a popular multiplayer shooter, Psyonix would later go on to develop wildly chaotic car football game Rocket League. Unreal Tournament 2004 is a great multiplayer shooter with a wide variety of content, and it's fitting that it's something of a fan favourite in the series. Like its predecessor, 2004 featured a robust modding community around it, but the nature of this community was changed greatly by the advances in technology. Unreal Engine 2 switched from an almost purely brush-based approach to map design to a mix of brushes and static meshes. While the use of meshes allows for a much higher level of detail than before, it also increases the workload required to create a single map by an order of magnitude. It was now much harder for an individual to tinker and build maps alone due to the necessity to create a variety of custom meshes, and the specificity of static meshes tends to make them less useful for reuse in other maps. This resulted in far fewer new maps being released. Still a huge amount, mind you. Unreal Archive, the largest host of Unreal maps and mods in the modern age, lists Unreal Tournament 2004 as having just over 6,000 maps available for download, more than you could likely play in a lifetime, but far fewer than the almost 25,000 available for the original Unreal Tournament. The higher workload required for a single map means individuals were less able to produce large amounts of work, and so most modding was performed by small groups instead. This did, however, lead to a number of total conversions, mods with larger development teams that drastically altered gameplay, or even built entirely new games on top of the framework provided by the engine. These were present in the original too, but the ratio of individual maps to larger scale mods shifted since teams were more necessary for any kind of modding, and larger teams tended to get more ambitious. The Xbox saw its own exclusive series of Unreal games in the form of 2 Unreal Championship games. I couldn't record footage of these unfortunately, but they're worth talking about briefly anyway, or at least one of them is. The first Unreal Championship was effectively just a port of Unreal Tournament 2003 to the Xbox. Unreal Championship 2, the Liandri conflict on the other hand, actually started life as the framework for Unreal Tournament 2005 before pivoting in its own direction. Unreal Championship 2 made some major changes to the basic formula of combat in order to accommodate the limited inputs and reduced precision of controllers. Available weapons are similar to the main games with some rebalancing, since you're limited to selecting 2 at the start of the match, 1 energy and 1 explosive, plus a sidearm. On top of this, you now have a melee weapon as well, with toggleable third-person view to go with them. Finally, characters were more important. Each one had their own specific melee weapon and sidearm, as well as different speed and health stats. Broadly, these were split across light, medium and heavy characters. I'll be generous and not rag on the slightly boring design decision of making all female characters light and having all of your light characters be female. Often there's a knee-jerk reaction to any kind of adjustment or streamlining for console markets as being dumbing down, but in this instance, I think it works nicely. The gameplay differences do make it easier to play on a controller, as well as helping to differentiate it from its PC cousins. I'm also fond of the heavier focus on characters. Each one has a backstory and their own tournament ladder to play in, but the main draw was the Ascension rights, a full single-player campaign with cutscenes. It tells the story of the Nukti Ascension rights, a championship sponsored and managed by the Liandri Corporation, where the winner will become the new emperor of the planet Nukti. The game being set on a single planet leads to a much more unified aesthetic. There's still a variety, the traditional mix of industrial areas, high sci-fi and ancient ruins are all present, but throughout there is a more consistent sense of an underlying, vaguely ancient Egyptian tinge to everything, which brings the setting together nicely. This feels like the first time one of the more multiplayer-focused games has tried to actually establish a setting, rather than a series of vignettes, and I appreciate the effort even if there isn't much interest in maintaining continuity with the rest of the series. In the Ascension Rights campaign, you play as Anubis, prince of one of the Nukti royal families, and favourite to win the rights 10 years ago, before disappearing. Overall, it's a straightforward enough story, but entertaining nonetheless. He was quietly working in a forgotten military outpost since then, but upon discovering that his ex-fiancée Selket is entering the rights this time around, and is likely to win, he is so incensed that she must not be allowed to win, for reasons that are vague and unexplored. He enters the tournament to stop her. There's a decidedly wrestling-esque tone to the writing and dialogue, especially in the interactions between contestants, which is kind of fitting, and the larger-than-life melodrama does excuse some of the more extravagant character designs. You fight your way through the tournament as Anubis, eventually coming to the final where of course you face off against Selket herself. With the respawn system turned off, you finally kill Selket, and Anubis is very upset by this, so he makes a deal with the Liandri Corporation. They will resurrect her using the expensive and secretive Necris process in exchange for him entering the main tournament as a contender, and certain support for Liandri now that he's emperor. This is where the break in continuity sneaks in. The Necris have been present in the series since the first Unreal tournament. They've been the Goth team. Character descriptions in the original established them as an alien race, and the Fader as a secret society of Necris fighting a guerrilla war against humanity. In Championship 2, the Necris are humans resurrected by the Fader Corporation's secret Necris process, but the Necris would appear again in the next game as a primary antagonist, with a completely new backstory all over again. I don't actually mind this lack of continuity personally. I always try to consider things on their own merits, and arguments as to lore accuracy or canonicity don't interest me or act as a marker of quality one way or another. But I'm fully aware that other people are very into this sort of thing, and I can't help but feel that in some way this lack of a sense of unified setting between the various games in the series has hurt its widespread appeal in comparison to more cohesive and established settings. There's actually another major connection to the rest of the series that's worth noting. The Nali are back for the first time since Unreal Tournament, where they were added as playable characters in the second bonus pack released. Unfortunately, their inclusion is kind of horrifying when considered for more than a few moments. They appear exclusively as part of a new game mode, entitled Nali Slaughter, in which you are dropped into an arena with only melee weapons and have to get the most points by, unsurprisingly, slaughtering the unarmed Nali. In lore, it's set up as a game invented by the Scar and introduced to the tournament recently. In reality, making a game mode out of slaughtering an unarmed and colonised species trafficked off their homeworld for just this occasion, for fun, is a pretty grim inclusion in the game. I don't think the developers meant anything by this, and I'm not going to be too harsh. The mode itself, connotations aside, is pretty solidly fun. A mad dash to rack up easy kills as quick as possible is a good blast for a mode, but making the targets of this mode the Na'Li specifically is an example of maybe not thinking hard enough about the underlying message of the design decisions being made. Again, I really don't think this is an intentional commentary on subjugated and colonised peoples, just an oversight with grisly implications, and that isn't enough to affect the overall quality of the game, which is for the most part a fresh and medium appropriate spin on the franchise. Unfortunately, now very difficult to get your hands on, given its nature as an Xbox exclusive. In 2000, Epic began development of a game called Unreal Warfare. The game was the original reason for the development of the Unreal Engine 2, and while it would never be released, it would influence the development of every game in the series after the original Unreal tournament. Later development would be rebooted using an early version of the Unreal Engine 3, and would drop the Unreal title to just be Warfare. This project would eventually develop into the first Gears of War game, so it's no surprise then that visually, Gears of War and Unreal Tournament 3 share a lot of similarities. The men are all impossibly hench slabs of muscle, the women Victoria's Secret's model in power armour. It's even fair to say that the protagonist Reaper and antagonist Akasha are visually similar to Gears of War's Marcus Phoenix and Queen Mira respectively. None of this is particularly surprising, or even that much of a problem. 2007 was very much within the era of so-called bro games, and a lot of Unreal Tournament 3's visual and narrative choices fall well within that archetype. Unfortunately, it also adopts the era's colour palette. There's still some red and blue to differentiate teams, but for the most part it's muddy and desaturated, which is disappointing for a series that has historically relied on such a vivid colour set as part of its core visual language. Like Unreal Championship 2, it features a full campaign rather than the simpler ladder matches of earlier games. Unlike Championship 2, it's got nothing to do with a tournament. You play as Reaper, leader of a small squad working as mercenaries for the Izanagi Corporation after a Necris High Inquisitor, Akasha, attacked your colony. You start out fighting Axon Corporation, then Liandri, after which Necris attack again and you have to fight them off, before finally going rogue and attacking the Necris homeworld yourself. It's a basic enough setup, but the narrative has to bend over backwards to justify the tournament-style combat during a war. Death matches are wearing down the enemy's portable respawner charges, which is fair enough if a little weird. With Capture the Flag, you're fighting with more advanced respawners that don't run out of charge, so you need to take the field lattice generators from their respawner to yours, which will destroy them, and if you destroy enough of these flags, the respawner shuts down. It's a really convoluted solution, it feels kind of hokey, and it just seems silly and contrived compared to Unreal Championship 2's more straightforward approach to a campaign. The campaign being split into different sections does give it an opportunity to play with the different map aesthetics through the different parts. Early on you're on Izanagi's home turf, so it's mostly pseudo-Japanese environments. Fighting Liandri takes you to more industrial sci-fi environments, and then when the Necris attack you get to revisit many previous maps, only now with Necris tentacles reaching down from the sky and curling through the map. I'm particularly fond of the maps set on the Necris homeworld. Its closest real-world analogue would likely be Byzantine architecture, large ornate buildings with many domes and towers, but made darker and more alien. It's a pretty unique aesthetic outside anything in the series so far, but still feels like it fits within it, and there's some of the few environments where the more desaturated colour palette feels like it adds to the visuals rather than detracting. It also fits with the Necris' new role in the plot as a semi-religious military order working under the Fader Corporation. The plot and writing overall definitely leave a lot to be desired. Characters are all one note, the wrestling-esque vibe is still there, but feels like everyone is a dumb jarhead now it's supposed to be in a military setting. The character Malcolm is the closest thing the series has to a mascot. He's been a playable model since the first Unreal Tournament, but he's canonically the highest awarded champion of the tournaments, and was the announcer of the Nocti Ascension rights back in Championship 2. Here, he acts as a military advisor and feels kind of out of place, even within such an already muddled setup. But the gameplay is still solid. Vehicles have been expanded beyond the slightly modified version of Onslaught, now rebranded as Warfare, and are also available in certain Capture the Flag maps. And while the muddy colour palette and slightly hazy post-processing of Unreal Engine 3 can make some of the maps a little hard to read at times, enemies still stand out nicely, and combat is still fast and engaging. But there's not a lot here that hasn't been done better by one of the earlier games. This even goes for the modding side of things. As ever, more focus on meshes and high fidelity have further increased the amount of work required for modders, but also the new more drab aesthetic has actually limited the kinds of maps that fit in with the game aesthetically. The map count on Unreal Archive has dropped again to just over 2,000. Even Unreal Tournament 2003, a game which was only out for a year and a half before being replaced by 2004, has more maps available for download. It also saw a drop in the number of total conversions, though this was for a different reason. Unreal Engine 3 was the first version of the engine that Epic released for free as the Unreal Development Kit. While modders could use previous editors for free to mod the games, this was a full release of the engine able to create standalone games, so anyone could use and develop games on the Unreal Engine without first licensing it from Epic, and would only have to pay Epic a licensing fee if it earned above a certain amount. This was a great move overall, and it's a model Epic continues to use to this day for newer versions of the engine, but it did mean any teams making a total conversion would just make a standalone game instead, which meant Unreal Tournament 3 never really had a huge creative community behind it. Despite having an actually quite solid multiplayer suite attached to it, Unreal Tournament 3 was definitely the least popular of the series. Part of this is just due to the arena shooter not being as popular as it once was, with the newer and larger market of console gamers looking for other sorts of online games that worked better with a controller. But it's also due to an unfortunate launch window. Unreal Tournament 3 released 2 weeks after Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, which fundamentally altered the online shooter space in ways that wouldn't start to shift until almost a decade and a half later. In 2014, Epic announced and then launched the Early Access Alpha for Unreal Tournament. Graphical advancements have become more and more granular in the last decade, but utilising the newly launched Unreal Engine 4, it was an absolutely gorgeous update on the series. Unfortunately, in 2003, Epic not only shut down the servers, but also completely removed the game client from their Epic launcher. They did something similar to the rest of the series. Every game has had its servers shut down, all games were delisted, some were released for free, but ultimately it was kind of a death sentence for the series. The reboot is still playable through a fan project, but there's no Epic-sanctioned way of playing it these days. It's a real shame too. The reboot played almost like a distilled version of the entire tournament series before it. Movement was most like the original, but with some of the new movement additions added in the later games, giving it a fantastically smooth feeling, and the weapon set was mostly an even more balanced and updated version of 3's. Unfortunately, as much as I liked the game and wish it had continued, it was more or less doomed from the start for several reasons. For starters, it's an unfortunate fact that its specific brand of arena shooter just wasn't that popular at the time of its launch. Doom wouldn't revive interest in classic shooters for another 2 years, and even since then the fast arena-focused gameplay hasn't been a dominant force in multiplayer for decades. This means that ultimately the community was smaller than it needed to be to sustain interest, an especially unfortunate outcome given the philosophy behind the game's development. Community maps have been a major component of Unreal since the beginning, and the plan with the reboot was to focus on community-made content, even going so far as to release the source code and crowdsource some of the development on GitHub. The game would be released for free, but funded through the sale of user-made mods, maps, and cosmetics on a marketplace. When it launched into early access, it did so with very few maps, and only a few of them finished, with the majority being at an early art pass or even completely greyboxed stage. This lack of content added difficulty to building a large enough community to support user-generated content, especially given the ever-increasing complexity of that. As I've said throughout this video, it was far easier for individuals to build levels when the graphical fidelity was lower. Unreal and Unreal Tournament even listed the specific author of each map, though their work was obviously supplemented by artists and composers providing extra assets to be used. By the time of Unreal Tournament 4, however, competitive sensibilities meant that properly balancing and designing a map took longer than ever, let alone the huge time investment to properly create the assets required to do a full art pass of even one map. The smaller community of the reboot means that it couldn't support enough small teams with the time and talents required to produce enough maps to keep interest in the game. Ultimately, interest gradually fizzled, with development officially ending in 2017, after the developers were transferred to a different project. That project was Fortnite. Fortnite started as a pretty underwhelming horde survival game with building mechanics. It's only after it released its free-to-play Battle Royale mode that it started to gain traction and became the juggernaut it is today. Fortnite takes a lot of the underlying plans for Unreal Tournament 4, free-to-play but run on microtransactions, and a focus on community-made content, but applied them better. While Unreal Tournament's editor was identical to the Unreal editor, Fortnite uses an in-game creation system that is much easier for individuals to tinker with and learn than the full editor, but still allows them to graduate to using Unreal Engine for Fortnite, a more powerful toolset but still simplified from the full Unreal Engine if they want to work on more complex projects or if they're a corporate sponsor. As for the market, Unreal Tournaments was barely finished and mostly placeholder. While Fortnite's is such a nightmare of Skinner boxes and dark design patterns, it's almost accurate to describe it less as a games marketplace and more as a marketplace that happens to have a game attached. Fortnite has become the testbed and driver of Unreal Engine's development ever since, upgrading to Unreal Engine 5 in late 2021, before its official release in 2022. This means that Unreal Engine 5 will be the first version of the engine not to be used in the development of an Unreal game, and that's sad. Epic has become increasingly and even exclusively focused on games as a service, and the Unreal series is a relic of a different era, overshadowed by its developers' newer venture. For better or likely for worse, from here on out the development of Unreal Engine is inextricably tied to Fortnite. Unreal never managed to be a major player in the gaming sphere, but its importance in driving development in one of the most widely used engines earns it a place in gaming history. Unfortunately, Epic doesn't seem to mind if it stays there, so we won't be returning to Na Pali again. Thanks for watching.